Welcome to Mount Prospect Public Library's Library Life. I'm Cathy Cushing. Today we'll visit with author Tyra Manning to discuss her heartfelt memoir, Where the Water Meets the Sand. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, is the nation's largest grassroots organization dedicated to building better lives for the millions of Americans affected by mental illness. Joining me on Library Life to discuss her library event presented in conjunction with NAMI is author and educator Dr. Tyra Manning. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Manning, you've battled with depression most of your life. Can you tell us a little bit about your first experiences and when you first realized that something might be wrong?
In retrospect, my father died when I was 9 years old. He died at the age of 36, and he died of a heart attack. And I was extremely close to my father. It was one of those days, 1956, where I was daddy's little girl and my brother was mom's little boy, and we did things together in partnerships. And yet I knew that my father was ill because I'd heard my aunts talking about the fact that he was very ill, and my mother and father traveled a lot, going to different doctors and hospitals across the United States looking for a cure.
Right.
He had arteriosclerosis, but it was so bad that he died at the age of 36. And at that time, we didn't have many of the things, the medical practices that we have today.
Right.
So during that time that they were traveling, they'd come home for a while and then they'd leave again. That whole fear of losing Daddy was very clear and very strong. As a result of that, I had a difficult teenage time, but in 1969, I met the love of my life. But his dream was to be an Air Force pilot, and I knew that when we married. And he finished Texas Tech University in Lubbock before I did, and he was stationed back in Lubbock for pilot training. That was during the Vietnam War. And he knew and I knew that when he finished his pilot training and earned his wings, in all probability he would be deployed to Vietnam.
And by this time you and Larry have a daughter, Laura. How did you deal with your anxiety?
Once he was deployed and he did get his orders, I became more and more frightened and scared and, in retrospect, depressed. Larry left for Vietnam, and even prior to that I had started secretly drinking and I became bulimic, but I would keep that from Larry as I was trying to deal with and coping. I knew I couldn't ask him not to go. It was the dream of his life. And because I knew that, I couldn't do that. So after he left, I was speaking with my gynecologist. He asked me how I was doing, and he said, "Doesn't seem like you're doing great." And I told him I wasn't, that I missed Larry, I couldn't sleep, I was having trouble with my studies, I was still at the university. And so he said to me, "I have a friend who's a new psychiatrist in town, you should go see him." I did. And my depression grew worse, and I was hospitalized at Methodist Hospital on the psychiatric ward. That happened twice. And the second time he said to me, "Tyra, if you'll go to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, that Carl Menninger and family started, you can get better faster." So I left Seminole, Texas, and where I had been staying with my mother. I left our baby girl and I went to Topeka, Kansas to the Menninger Clinic. I wanted to get well. And Larry and I had been talking on cassette tapes that I'd meet him in Hawaii where the water meets the sand for R&R, and he'd say, "Get better, hon, so you can meet me in Hawaii." When I arrived at the Menninger Clinic, I was diagnosed with clinical depression. And clinical depression is a severe, it's not like people who suffer from depression or clinical depression. It's not like, "Oh, I'm not having a good day, I feel depressed." It's not like that. It's an illness that people who suffer with it or their families need treatment. while I was there, Larry was killed, and I couldn't have been in a better place. When I left Meninger after 8 months, I was able to function. I was doing great. I moved our baby to Topeka, and I decided to stay there. I still lacked a year on my bachelor's degree, so I started back to college.
You know, you mentioned that you were going to meet Larry where the water meets the
Yes.
sand, and that is the title of your book.
That's correct.
That you sat down and decided to write. Why did you feel compelled to write this book?
I wanted to honor Larry and our daughter, but I became very close to the patients that were at Meninger. And I call Meninger my own peculiar finishing school. And over the years, as I got better and finished my doctorate and became a principal and a superintendent of schools, I might share that I'd been a patient at the Meninger Clinic. And so many times, those dear friends would say, "Oh, Tyra, you weren't like those people." And I would say, "You have to understand, I had the credentials." So I wanted to honor those people that I lived with on the unit. And the book has stories about them and how important they were to me and how we got better together. And I wanted, the mission is to try to work hard to diminish the stigma that keeps people talking about their illness or afraid to get help because there's the stigma
Of course.
to seek treatment, or family members feel embarrassed, or if it's their first time, not always, but they start dealing with a family member or a child that is diagnosed with a mental illness. So years ago, I promised myself I'd write this book, and finally, after retiring 2 or 3 times, I've been able to do it. And those are the reasons, and to speak out. We also, particularly in terms of veterans and all people, there are many people that aren't able to find good treatment.
Right.
Or to afford good treatment. And so that's my life's mission now, is to work on that.
Now you have an expression that you use in the book, weller than well.
Yes.
Why does that phrase mean so much to you?
Well, Dr. Carl wrote a book, and I learned about it. Some of the patients talked about it when I became a patient at Meninger. And I went in 1970 and left in 71. I'm sorry, left in 70. But they talked about the fact that Dr. Carl wrote in his book that with treatment, people can get better, weller than well. And what he meant by that is, with great treatment and support, people may get better than they've ever been, weller than well. And in the book, when I was talking about being a patient there, and I had my own friends, and we were higher functioning, I thought, who knows? But human beings have a way of having a pecking order, you know?
Of course, yes.
You see that in schools, if grown-ups don't make sure that that's not prevalent or active. And it happened there. Those of us who, at that particular time, could be qualified to go on a walk with an aide and leave the unit down to the pond, or go to the dining room with supervision, where others had to eat on trays, as I did my first 2 weeks there.
Right.
So weller than well, I decided, well, those of us who can do these things, we're getting weller than well. So I had that problem myself but I want to be clear. And if you've read the book, there's the people who were very ill loved in their own way. The night Larry was killed and they found out about it, the staff told everybody. They invited me to come to the patient lounge to be with them. So the name of that chapter is Be With Us. And in their own way, they reached out and told me they were sorry. And they played special music they knew I would like.
So there was a camaraderie there.
It was like a family bringing somebody, coming to see someone who had lost a loved one. That sensitivity, no matter how ill they were all there.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the addictions that you were mentioning and how you conquered them, because that's quite a few addictions: drinking, bulimia. and even the cutting?
The bulimia was the first addiction, and somebody said to me, "How did you know to do that?" And I said, "I didn't know to do that. It was just instinctive." The cutting was raising the bar, and why did I do that? I don't know. It was instinctive. When I had terrible anxiety back then, when I was so ill as a young woman, my nose would burn. The anxiety would be so hard. I would describe my nose as being, it felt like it would have looked like Rudolph. It just would burn. And that was a sign that my anxiety was rising to me internally. That's how I understood it.
Right.
And when I would eat and throw up, or if I would cut myself, back then when I was so ill, I remember thinking it was as if the bad feelings and the bad would bleed out. Very, as I tell you this today, it sounds, but
it was sort of a release for you.
It was a release for me. It worked, and that's all I knew at that time. I was so miserable, but it worked. When I was a child, a teenager, and I started driving, I would go out to Daddy's grave, and when I got to be old enough, I would buy beer and go out there. So I had a propensity for addictions, for things and as a young woman after I left, I became addicted to alcohol. I functioned, but I knew I had a problem, and I reached out for help.
And those problems are always sort of there looming.
I will tell you the reason I became really so confronted. I was director of personnel for a large school district, and part of my job was the Employees Assistance Program. And I was great at getting people to go get help. And I kept saying to myself, maybe you need to take advantage of this. And the truth of the matter is, I did go to a support program, and I got sober in July the 1st, 1981. And I'm so grateful. So
it was a struggle for so
I
many
had
years.
A propensity.
Yeah.
I wasn't drinking all the time during that period when I was a youngster after Larry and I married, but later on I picked it up again. So I wasn't bulimic or cutting during all that time. That quit when I left Menninger, but human beings sometimes find ways to cope, and those were my coping mechanisms. Later on, I can remember having children in my school as a principal who girls were eating and throwing up, or eating at lunchtime, throwing up in the girls' restroom. And because I knew what that was and how that could become addictive, I had a teacher that supervised the restrooms, and then if we saw that somebody was having that problem, they went to the counselor and we contacted their parents. So I'm not suggesting that my life was easy, but the great news is I had great treatment. I got better. I was able to contribute, and it was redemptive to be able to get to have the kind of treatment I have. And I want other people to have that.
I would like to just circle back because we are going to start
I'm
running out
sorry.
of time. But you, in 2006, you had a little bit of closure with regard
Yes.
to Larry,
Yes.
in that his remains were found
Right.
35 years after
Yes.
he was shot down.
Yes.
Tell us, was that closure for you? Did you feel that that was something that you needed?
I made a promise to Larry as a young man before he went to Vietnam that if he didn't come home, he'd be buried at Arlington. That always was in the back of my mind, and I always believed that one day that would happen. I know it sounds nutty, but I believed that it would happen. It wasn't closure, it was a promise kept.
Right.
And 36 men, 18 who flew with him out of Da Nang into Laos, where his plane actually went down, and 18 who were in pilot training with him came to that funeral. And people from my school district, where I'd been superintendent, and parents came. And Larry's life was celebrated, but Laura got to hear from those men on the ground where Larry's plane went down, what happened to her father. And she got to hear about him from them. And it meant everything for her to hear what he was like in Vietnam and how his courage and what a good guy he was, and that he loved her and he talked about her all the time to them. I could never have done that for her. So it was priceless.
Well, I thank you so much for being with me today.
I
This has
thank
been
you.
so inspirational. You can find Dr. Manning's book, Where the Water Meets the Sand, at bookstores everywhere. For more information on this or any upcoming Mount Prospect Public Library event, call the library at area code 847-253-5675 or visit our website at www.mppl.org.